I love when I find out an origin story I think I knew turns out to be either a widely believed false rumor, or when I find out other people learn different origin stories. That's what this episode turned into. So if you think you already know the story behind today's subject, you may be surprised to learn there are actually multiple versions. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind the teddy bear. But first, a quick message. By the time this comes out, it'll be a little over a month until the story behind book is released. I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who has supported me and the book, and who have shared the link with their friends and family, and who have already pre-ordered copies. I'd love to give away some swag, so if you're listening to this and you already bought your copy, email me a screenshot of your receipt or your confirmation email anytime between now and October 15th, the day it releases, and we'll do a giveaway for some Story Behind swag. You can send that to thestorybehindpod@gmail.com, and in case you're driving and don't want to remember email addresses, just visit thestorybehindpodcast.com and you can contact me that way. Anyway, thank you to everyone who has already bought the book, and if you're looking for your copy, you can go to thestorybehindbook.com. Theodore Roosevelt was known as a skilled hunter, but he was also a conservationist, which is someone who advocates for the protection of wildlife and the environment. The story goes that in 1902, the Mississippi governor invited Roosevelt on a hunting expedition, and his guides had already gotten ahead and tied a bear to a tree for Roosevelt to shoot. Depending on which story you heard, though, the bear could have either been old and already ailing in health, or, as it was depicted in a famous comic that came out after the story became legend, it was a baby bear cub. Another way the story differs in some versions is sometimes Roosevelt shoots the old ailing bear out of pity, or in other versions, Roosevelt saw the bear tied to a tree and thought it was unsportsmanlike to shoot a bear that was already captured, so he set him free, or her free, again, depending on the version you heard. Either way, it showed a compassionate side to this rugged man's man. But there's another more gruesome version of the story. And this might be a good time to skip forward if you have really, really young ears with you. The hunting dogs that were accompanying Roosevelt's party discovered an old bear. After the bear killed one of the dogs, one of the guides hit the bear in the head with the butt of his hunting rifle, knocking him unconscious. Like in the other versions, the bear was tied to a tree for Roosevelt to shoot. But when Roosevelt came across the gruesome sight, he refused. However, the bear was still killed by another in the group and brought back to camp. Apparently, this version is documented in a picture of a dead bear slung over a horse in the Roosevelt collection at Harvard University, only to be discovered by Roosevelt's great-grandson, Tweed Roosevelt, in 1989. Regardless of what version actually happened, a political cartoonist named Clifford Berryman read about the story and drew a cartoon called Drawing the Line in Mississippi that appeared in the Washington Post, or Washington Star, depending on the source. It appeared in November of that year, and in that cartoon, instead of being tied to a tree, the bear was a quivering baby cub with a childlike face that was put on a leash, with Roosevelt putting his hand up and refusing to shoot it. When the cartoon came out, it became so popular, it would probably today be considered a viral meme. It's also probably the reason many of us heard the version in which no bears were harmed. When Morris and Rose Michtom of Brooklyn, New York heard the story, they came up with the idea to create a toy bear to celebrate the president's compassion and sell it in their local candy store. Supposedly, they got Roosevelt's permission to call it a teddy bear, and according to the couple's son, Benjamin, Roosevelt doubted the stuffed bear would even take off. But the next year, the couple found they needed to start mass-producing these bears and created Ideal Toy Company. By 1908, they were so big, a Michigan minister warned that the toy bears were overtaking dolls in the market, meaning that little girls wouldn't be able to hone their maternal instincts. But I guess that didn't stop people from continuing to buy the bears. One of the sweetest stories that brought the Ideal Toy Company and the Roosevelts together again in 1963 was when the teddy bear was celebrating its 60th anniversary. Benjamin Michtom reached out to Teddy's daughter Alice about posing with the bear, but she refused, saying, "What does a 79-year-old doll want with a 60-year-old bear?" Instead, Michtom reached out to Teddy's grandson Kermit, asking if his children would be interested in posing with the bear, letting him know that afterward the bear would be sent to the Smithsonian Institution. Kermit agreed, and his children, Mark and Ann Roosevelt, posed with the bear for a photo shoot. But following that photo shoot, the bear was nowhere to be found. And if you have kids and you've tried to take a toy away from them, you probably know where this story is headed. It turns out Mark and Ann had grown so attached to the bear they hid it from their parents so they wouldn't have to give it up. But by the next year, they changed their minds and the bear was sent to the Smithsonian. Now, this version of the story behind teddy bears was one I didn't know about until researching, and it's not often written about, especially in America. It begins even before Roosevelt's famous hunting trip with a woman named Marguerite Steiff in Germany. As a young child, she suffered a high fever, which resulted in her legs becoming paralyzed, and she had continued pain moving her right arm. She was diagnosed with poliomyelitis, which is usually shortened to polio. But she grew up determined not to let that get in the way of living a full life, including being taken to school in a hay cart and even going to sewing school when she was 17, despite the constant pain. She even commissioned a sewing machine to be moderated so the flywheel could be operated with the left hand instead of the right. She began her own clothing business, and when she saw a pattern for a small stuffed elephant in a magazine, she began making them to be used as pincushions. But youngsters saw these pincushions and decided they would make better toys instead. Her stuffed elephants became a big seller, and she moved away from clothing and household items to making stuffed toys. She employed her nephew, Richard Steiff, who began sketching other animals to be turned into stuffed toys. One such sketch was known as Bear 55PB, and it was the first stuffed toy with movable arms and legs. If you remember from earlier in the episode, Theodore Roosevelt went on his hunting trip in 1902. The same year, Richard drew up his sketch and production began on the bear. Marguerite herself was skeptical of it. Let's actually take a bit of a tangent here to talk about how bears were seen back then. This was a time before there were lovable bear characters in pop culture like Yogi Bear, Paddington, and Winnie the Pooh, and before lines of parents and kids swarmed the malls to make their own stuffed creations at Build-A-Bear. Bears at that time were seen as monsters, and the idea of creating a stuffed toy out of something that was known to slaughter humans and other small animals was absurd when you think about it. It was no wonder Marguerite had her reservations, but Richard had faith and brought the bears to a toy trade fair. When an American trader came across them, he ordered 3,000 and brought them back to the United States in 1906. And supposedly, he was the one to name the bears after the president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt. Information for this episode was sourced from History.com, Mental Floss, the National Park Service, and more links which can be found in the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. By the way, if you'd like to hear more about bears, including some more facts about teddy bears, check out the podcast Varmints, episode 73, all about black bears. And you might hear a familiar voice on there if you ever heard the promo I play sometimes with my daughter. This week on Trivia Tuesday in the Story Behind discussion group on Facebook, Paul posted bubble wrap was originally supposed to be 3D wallpaper. That didn't take off. Then it was going to be sold as greenhouse insulation. Another bad idea. A worker at the bubble wrap factory found it would make the perfect thing to wrap a computer printer in for shipping, and the rest is history. Actually, the rest is in the Story Behind book, which, funnily enough, Paul didn't even realize that when he posted that in the group. But that's just something to look forward to October 15th. Glenn posted allspice is not a blend of spices, but just one plant, the unripe berries of the myrtle pepper. The name comes from the 17th century. The English thought the taste was like a combination of cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. If you'd like to talk about trivia you pick up during the week and have it read on the show, join the Story Behind discussion group on Facebook. This episode was brought to you by the Story Behind executive producers who support the show through the Patreon page at patreon.com/thestorybehind. Thanks for listening.